Hello and welcome to People Working Together for Your Safety. I'm your host, Stan Salot Jr. Our show today, Beyond Recycling, Challenges of Chemical Cleanups, is all about the issues surrounding the cleanup and disposal of asbestos. I am pleased to have today Mr. Tony Nocito, a pioneer in the specialized field of non-thermal EPA-approved destruction of asbestos process. That's a mouthful. Known as, the way I like to say it, ABCOV methods, actually. And he is the subject matter expert today on this subject of asbestos. I also have standing in for our regular guest, Frank Chano, senior partner at Goldberg Segala. We actually have Andrew Schultz, one of his partners, who specializes also in chemical cleanup, the legality, the legal aspects of this. He'll be with us today also discussing issues related to this toxic material, how it affects us, what has to be done to dispose of it, and some of the legal ramifications faced by those dealing with it, and mitigation process, not wanting to confuse folks. So, Andrew, first, let me welcome you to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And now let's get into the heart of this. We actually have three segments. Let me touch on this. We have three segments. We'll have some breaks in between. But we're going to be discussing, as I said, the things that relate to that asbestos and the cleanup. And to do that, I've got Tony Nocito with us today. Hello, Tony.
Hi, Stan. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, and I really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us. I understand you're up there in the frozen tundra of New York or someplace like that.
We have a vicious snowstorm right now, so we're in the tundras of that.
Well, fortunately, we're keeping you inside where you can be nice and warm and chat with the audience.
That's a great thing to do.
Right.
And I'd like to thank you for having me on your show, People to People, Voice America. And I want to thank you as well for allowing me to speak about the non-thermal EPA-approved simple chemical physical ABCOV method of asbestos destruction, which is the only non-thermal asbestos destruction process available in the world today. It provides zero asbestos waste to the landfill, zero asbestos liability to the asbestos owner. ABCOV destroys all 6 forms of asbestos embedded in all matrices of asbestos-containing material, and it reduces waste by about 50%.
Well, that's fantastic. And for those of you listening, let me interject here that Tony has dedicated the past 30 years of his life to become a pioneer in the specialized field of non-thermal EPA-approved destruction asbestos process. And as he pointed out, that's known as the ABCOV method. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That, and I think I can say this without any concerns or issues, but Tony has worked in removing such materials from major projects, including Macy's, Wayne, is it? New Jersey?
Wayne, New Jersey. Did one in Smithtown. We've done work in several airports. I had my first plant up in Griffith Air Force Base up in Rome, New York. Unfortunately, it was realigned, and I had a second one down in Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. I've worked with nuclear waste with the Department of Energy, and I worked several other projects as a contractor, removing and demolition of asbestos. I worked in Madison Square Garden, where I basically started the second part of the development of this. They were kind enough to give me the southeast escalator tower to fool around with the process to destroy the asbestos. And we tried several different things. We got to a point where we found what the best method was, but it needed a lot of improvement. It took about 30 years to develop this. I still see material, asbestos-containing material that I've never seen before. And you have to know how to treat it, believe it, after all these years. So that's what took all the time. And I'm sure I'll see other materials I've never seen before.
Yes. It's an interesting topic, and it's one that, growing up, I started as a youngster working for my dad, who was a general contractor, and I can remember using and implementing things with asbestos. That was before we realized that it had some issues. Andrew, if I could draw you into this a bit, I suspect there's a number of legal issues surrounding asbestos and the disposal of that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure Tony, as being part of this, is steeped in the federal and local regulations that govern everything to do with asbestos, and each state and many localities have specific protocols that require, obviously, you can imagine the type of segregation of an area and wearing of appropriate gear and things of that nature for those who are remediating asbestos, and all the way from the point of the building or the entity to which the insulation or whatever the asbestos-containing component product is, all the way to disposal and landfill or however else it is being disposed of. It is a highly regulated, very expensive proposition, and I think it's important to start out with the point that a lot of people think of asbestos as purely related to pipe insulation or some sort of spray-on insulation for commercial buildings. But asbestos was used by many, many, many companies in many different types of products. And that is an ongoing litigation issue, which we are now in the fifth decade or so of asbestos litigation, which began with what we call the traditional products, which are the first ones that I mentioned, the pipe insulation, things of that nature. The litigation has morphed considerably. All of those, what we call on the defense side, bad actors, those who actually manufactured certain types of insulation that are probably the most dangerous, are now bankrupt. They're all gone. And so where we are today is the litigation is exposure to products all the way into, at some point, the 80s, 1980s, for other non-traditional, what we call non-traditional products that I think most people don't think about may have contained asbestos. So it's a very complex legal system from the remediation point of view all the way to people claiming exposure to the product. And I think it has to be noted that the asbestos is there are a number of different types of asbestos that a lot of people get confused about too.
Right.
But the generally it's almost universally, I think, accepted that asbestos is not any hazard to anyone if it is not friable, meaning it does not go into the air. There is asbestos in the ambient air. You and I are breathing asbestos right now. It's just a matter of dose and the type of asbestos fibers that are released from, say, pipe insulation that contains a certain component, and the chemical composition that can happen if you inhale a certain amount over a specific period of time. So answering your questions, yep.
It's really an issue, and one that's been going on for a while.
And it'll continue to go on for years.
When did you first get involved with it? You indicated that you've been working on it for 30 years in your bio, but what kind of got you into this?
I started in the construction business as a paving and drainage contractor. And believe it or not, they used to have a thing called asbestos pipe that was transite pipe, which is concrete asbestos pipe. We used to put it in dry wells for drainage for a parking lot. I started in the demolition business in the wintertime and continued with the demolition business. And I got a project in Mason, and I hired an asbestos removal contractor, which I had to ultimately fire. And then I ended up in the asbestos business, which then I saw a need to do something, because this is one building. This is 200,000 square feet. There is multiple buildings with asbestos in them. Even the building I'm in today in New York, that's built 100 years ago, has asbestos in it. It has it in the walls. So I figured something had to be done to dispose of it. And they've changed the regulations over time. They have a new regulation, which is 108B under the circular. And correct me if I'm wrong, under circular, which requires financial assurance of future liabilities from companies that create the future liabilities. And circular requires treatment that permanently significantly reduce volume, mobility of substance, of hazardous substance, and toxicity. And ABCOV does all that with asbestos. Circular was eventually turned into Superfund.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember hearing about Superfund. I also remember, as you were mentioning that, I used to, one of my first jobs working for my dad as a youngster was actually carrying that pipe that you referred to from place to place for him so he could put it in wherever it needed to be.
Right. We used to put in the transit pipe. There's statistics, which I think I sent you, on the amount of people that die and exposed to asbestos every year. I took them out. There's at least 3,000 people a year die from mesothelioma. At least 125 million people a year are exposed to asbestos in the workplace. We anticipate that there will be, someone dies every 5 minutes from an asbestos-related disease. We anticipate that by the year 2030, 16 years from now, to be 5 to 10 million deaths from asbestos. And the fact is that more people die from asbestos-related disease than be killed in road accidents.
Yeah, that's a horrible statistic to hear. Weren't the Twin Towers? Weren't they? Wasn't?
I live 5 blocks from the Twin Towers, and my office is about 6 or 7 blocks. And
it's interesting. I have an interesting point of view with respect to the World Trade Center. If I may jump in real quick.
Yes, please.
Tony, the World Trade Center was built essentially in the 1960s, but in some part of the 70s. Asbestos insulation was part of the fireproofing that was used in those buildings. There was a remediation effort that took place, and only one of the towers up to, I think, the 20th floor had asbestos insulation remaining in it. So there were 2 issues that resulted from that fact. The first one is that after the towers collapsed, sadly, of course, the workers who, or I would use a different word, the emergency responders who flooded to the World Trade Center site in the immediate aftermath of the events. As you know, there was a lawsuit commenced by those workers, many lawsuits actually. They claimed exposure to asbestos as one of the many different types of environmental hazards. That was one of the main concerns expressed in the underlying litigation. But
Andrew,
Tony referenced it.
Andrew, if I could get you to hold right there for just a minute. We need to take a short break to identify the station and our sponsors. Kind of leave this as a bit of a cliffhanger for Andrew's part 2. Please be sure to come back and join us. We're going to step out for a quick break now. Welcome back to People, working together for your safety. I'm your host, Stan Salot Jr. Our show today, Beyond Recycling, Challenges of Chemical Cleanups, is about the issues surrounding the cleanup of and disposal of asbestos. I'm pleased to have Mr. Tony Nocito. And, Tony's a pioneer in the specialized field of non-thermal EPA-approved destruction asbestos process, known as ABCOV method, as my guest today, as well as Mr. Andrew Schultz, Senior Partner, Goldberg Segala. we've been discussing things related to asbestos, and while we were on break, I was chatting a bit with both Tony and Andrew about some of the things that went on. Apparently they are, well, not apparently, they were sharing with me that they're both from the New York area and very close to the Twin Towers. So without further ado, let's get back to this discussion. I think, Andrew, you were in the middle or just about to start talking about a part two to your comments.
I was essentially going to conclude that those who toiled for the benefit of all New York City residents, the emergency responders, there was a mass lawsuit, about 10,000 lawsuits, and part of the claims were exposure. There were fear of cancer claims of exposure to asbestos. It's more of the larger story is that I think there is a big fear, although there was no one diagnosed with any asbestos-related condition, that if you are potentially exposed to asbestos, people file lawsuits right away.
Right.
And there are those, as Tony mentioned, who are actually diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease such as mesothelioma. Those are very, very tough cases from a litigant's point of view, because they are actually causally related to exposure to certain types of asbestos. But from the larger docket, the larger lawsuit world, what's flooded our court system is filings of lawsuits that are not per se frivolous, but don't necessarily have a relationship to asbestos, but there are so many filings that you have to defend them, and many clients settle them, and that led to a lot of bankruptcies.
That's true, because there was a couple of articles in the Wall Street Journal recently about false claims of asbestos, and the asbestos reserves are running out, and they're paying people, and they're going to be, and insurance companies putting in $11 to $12 billion a year into the asbestos reserves, according to ASBES. So what Andrew is saying is right. Everybody is exposed to asbestos every day. There's no question about it. And the people at the World Trade Center, I worry about my children not today, but 25 years or 30 years from now, which asbestos disease takes time to develop inside the lungs. You get asbestosis, and then you get mesothelioma. Asbestosis is not cancer, but mesothelioma is. And I'm sure that Andrew is an expert in the area of mesothelioma exposure. The problem with the exposure is no one knows where they get it from. Some people have worked in it, they know. But some people have it and have never worked in it, and they don't know where they get it from. So that's one of the issues, I believe, if I'm not right.
It's a horrible disease. It's one of the worst diseases you can get. And it's a very painful disease, and essentially there's little cure, but science has gotten to the point where, there is a somewhat better prognosis, depending on how old you are, et cetera, for some additional months or years. So it's a very, very difficult diagnosis to receive. But what is, in the litigation context, what you see are a lot of claims that aren't mesothelioma. You see a lung cancer involving someone who has smoked 3 packs per day through their whole life, and then they say, "Oh, but I work with an asbestos-containing product." And as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of asbestos, and today the types of asbestos-containing products that are involved in the litigation are not the insulation that we spoke about earlier. They're encapsulated products that are made from different fibers, and if you really look at a scientist will tell you that the exposure is minimal. But this is the way our court system works, and by filing a lot of different claims, it piles on, courts get overwhelmed, it gets very expensive for companies, and that has led to a lot of bankruptcies. So the answering the question of why there are people who are diagnosed with mesothelioma but have no exposure. That's been a big question out there. Some people, some scientists will tell you that people are idiopathic. Some will say genetic, but there's really no answer for a lot of different people.
I would assume in some cases, if not a lot of cases, we first face the fact that if you ever potentially have a problem, you have to have done something appropriate in the legal system to protect yourself, or at least position. And I'm guessing at this, actually. I guess I'm asking the question. It seems like I have to take action to protect myself from the potential of a future issue with mesothelioma.
Protect yourself and your family.
Right. So is that part of this, what's going on, or am I missing something?
Well, yeah, I think the different people, defendants in the asbestos litigation, have taken different approaches. Some are extremely aggressive and will go to trial on any case because they firmly believe that it is impossible for a plaintiff to have ever contracted mesothelioma through exposure to this type of product, which is, say, an encapsulated something or other with a different asbestos fiber that is not generally accepted by most to have a relationship to mesothelioma. That has been met with mixed results. When I first started doing asbestos litigation, I was very young. There was an overwhelming number of filings of what we call pleural plaques. Now, pleural plaque is something that you get when you get an x-ray of your lung and they see there's a scarring on your lung. Those types of, and by the way, you, me, and probably almost all the listeners in your audience have some sort of scarring on their lung. It's
right.
It's what everybody has, but that was the majority of the filings in the litigation. So you can imagine trying to defend against tens of thousands of claims, going to depositions, and how much that must cost an insurer and a company that does well but has to pay significant millions of dollars in attorney's fees. It gets overwhelming, and a lot of companies have filed bankruptcy.
I interjected that it's probably the biggest industrial disaster in history, and it's the biggest litigation to swamp our courts, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew. I mean, they knew this is something that was known 2,000 years ago, that the Greek Strabo and the well-known Roman Pliny the Elder noticed sickness in the lungs of the slaves that worked in the asbestos mines, wove asbestos tablecloths, table napkins, wicks for candles. They noticed they had an early death. And in 1899, a British physician named Dr. H. Montague Murray recorded asbestosis for the first time. And in 1906, a factory inspector, his name was Eribold, noticed that 50 of his workers died of mesothelioma. In 1918, the insurance companies upped their rates because they understood that asbestos was causing disease. And in 1930, all the companies that manufactured asbestos knew that asbestos was dangerous, but never let it out to their workers. And you know who those companies are. Also, the health department, the health service, recognized the effects of asbestos on human health, and they recommended guidelines. But then on the onset of World War II, this is in 1938, when World War II broke out, we expanded our military base. We built new military bases. We built the Pentagon. We built ships. We built new government buildings, and all of which had a varied amount of asbestos. I know the Pentagon had 28 million pounds of asbestos in it. And then the Defense Logistics Agency during World War II stored around the country in different silos raw asbestos in case we couldn't get it, in case there was a shortage around the world. So that gives you some history of asbestos.
Yeah.
And that gives you...
I think, just picking up on what you're saying, I think it's important to note that there are different types of asbestos fibers. There is something called an amphibole type of asbestos fiber, and that comes from generally raw asbestos. It's generally, if you were to look at a picture of it, it's a curly, looks like a hair. There are the other general type of asbestos fiber, they're known generally as chrysotile, and that's essentially a straight, short type of fiber. The type of, the general science that I think most experts agree is that exposure to certain doses of amphibole asbestos, I don't want to get into the science too much, but that's what you find in the pipe insulation. That's what you find, for cement, things that were used in the type of products that you traditionally think to yourself, what is asbestos? Chrysotile asbestos was used in a lot of non-traditional types of products. And there's a raging debate about whether or not exposure to chrysotile asbestos can cause mesothelioma. That is a big debate.
I'm sorry about interrupting. They say that there's no safe exposure to asbestos. And I've read that over and over again. So the serpentines, which is chrysotile, is, if you're exposed to enough of it, is as dangerous. The amphiboles, which is, there's 5 of those, which you say is a curly, pseudolite is the one that looks like hair. Fiber. You're right. They're dangerous to the human health, and we don't know where we get it from. You said they are used. There's a combination of asbestos used in different types of materials, and they combine the serpentines and the amphiboles. Sometimes just one serpentine and one amphibole, or 2 amphiboles and 1 serpentine. I mean, I've seen this over the years. That's why I say it's taken so long to develop this process. So it's a matter of how you treat it, and you have to figure out the right formula to treat it.
Let me ask a question. We've only got a couple of minutes left here. When our audience is a mixed audience, it's a variety in a business environment that we communicate with here on the radio. What is it that as a consumer, is there anything either of you can suggest or would be advising that I pay attention to? Not that I have to be scared of. I'm not trying to scare people, but is there something out there in the day-to-day life, or is this really things that are built into other things and it depends on the job you're doing?
As a consumer, if you're buying a new house, you want to make sure what year it was built, to make sure there was no asbestos in it. There's a varied amount of buildings have it in it. You really can't tell as a consumer. They're not allowed to sell asbestos-containing materials anymore, although it's not outlawed in the United States, and it's still used. But it's used in brakes, it's used in clutches, and it's used in cement materials, and it's used in board, corrugated cement board.
So you really have to be asking questions relative to whatever you're doing at the time. Andrews, I understand that you have a train to catch. You're up there in that snowy northeastern country as well. So we're coming up to that time. I agreed that I'd let you know it's time to go catch your train. Any last comments before I let you run away from us?
I do. I have something sitting on my desk for about 17 years from Salt and Pepper, from Pepper and Salt cartoon. That was in the Wall Street Journal, and the father was sitting on his couch looking at his son's report card with great disappointment and letting his son know how he felt. And the son replied, "If your generation doesn't learn how to save the planet, it won't matter if my generation can't read or write." So that's my last comment.
Well, Tony, don't go away. I'm wanting to send Andrew off on his mission there to get home tonight, but I'll be back with you, so don't go away, Tony.
I wish you safe home, Andrew.
Thank you, Tony. And Stan, thank you very much. I would just conclude saying thank you for the opportunity, and I would just, if any consumer has any, asbestos has been pretty much taken out of the consumer product area, but if anyone has any concern about whether a product may or may not contain asbestos, the general rule is just don't work with it, don't touch it, don't do anything that would make it friable, and retain an expert like Tony to determine what it is.
Okay.
That's excellent advice.
Yeah. Okay, well, one of the things we do deal with is counterfeit, and I'm going to ask both of you to join me again on a future show because I am aware of some of the things going on outside the U.S. where some of the regulations aren't quite as strong as our own, and consequently we do attend, at times, we potentially have the risk of receiving something with a hazardous substance such as asbestos in them. So Tony, or Andrew rather, I'm going to wish you a safe journey home, and we're going to take a break here for just another radio identification and our sponsors. We'll be right back. Welcome back to People, working together for your safety. I'm your host, Stan Salot Jr. Our show today, Beyond Recycling, Challenges of Chemical Cleanups. It's all about the issues surrounding the cleanup and disposal of asbestos. I'm pleased to have on the show today Mr. Tony Nocito, a pioneer in the specialized field of non-thermal EPA-approved destruction asbestos process, known as ABCOV method. Tony's my technical guest on the show today, and we had Andrew Schultz with us as well, senior partner at Goldberg Segala. We knew that he was up there in the Northeast today where the snow is piling up quickly, so we excused him. We let him go home so he wouldn't get caught. I think he had one train left to catch. Tony, you're still with me there, right, Tony?
Yes, sir.
Outstanding. This thing called, let me find it again, this EPA-approved destruction asbestos process known as ABCOV method, as I understand, you created that methodology.
Yes, over a period of time. I first went to the Patel Memorial Institute to have them do the research, the original research, and they had problems with insurance and asbestos. So I ended up in Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech did some research, and they said they did this in the lab, and I underwrote both of them. And I then took it in the field, and like I say, it took 30 years because I see different types of material every time I do something. There's different constituents in the binder, and you have to know how to deal with that in order to destroy the asbestos. You have to get into it. So that's how I developed it. It was developed mainly in the field. Part of it was engineering, but the most part of it was visual. You have to see it, understand it, and understand how it operates, and that's the tricky part.
So does this method actually eliminate the need to find a place in the ground to hide it, or boxes to put it in and store it for the end of life?
Let me explain it. Well, it's a perpetual liability, and just keep in mind that all hazardous waste carry perpetual liability.
Right.
In the future, it's an expense.
Right.
And what happens is when asbestos is removed from a building, it's bagged, it's tagged, and let's say you and I own a building together, and
right.
We own it with asbestos, and the asbestos is sent to a landfill. That landfill eventually becomes a Superfund site. Your name and my name are on those bags, and we're responsible. We're what they call a responsible party to clean that asbestos up and move it to another site. There's also, under circular, like I said, they have to make sure they permanently and significantly reduce the toxicity, the volume, and the mobility of a hazardous substance. And there's a regulation called 108B right now under the circular or Superfund,
okay,
which requires companies that have a liability or a future liability to be able to put up some kind of an insurance policy, cash bond, or a bond for the future cleanup of that hazardous waste. There's also a law on a retired asset, where the retired asset, the utilities have a lot of them because they're closing down these coal plants. The retired asset falls under circular as well, or Superfund as well. And they have to clean those up and get rid of any hazardous waste that they can get rid of. And this is governed. This is governed under the EPA regulations or the government regulation under OSHA 20 CFR 1910 1001, NESHAP, which is 40 CFR Part 61. And the conversion facilities are regulated at 40 CFR 61-155. And there are burning facilities that are not efficient enough to do what I do, or cheap enough to do what I do. Because number one, they're burning, they're using high electricity, and the regulation requires you to, if you don't get it the first time, you put it through the process. My process follows the asbestos instruction right through process. Doesn't leave the process till it's destroyed, and then it's put out the door. And in some states, you may have to have a variance for the process. In other states, you may have to have an air permit. In all states, you have to follow the solid waste regulation. So,
it's a lengthy and complex. At minimum, it's a complex process of dealing with it.
Well, no, the longest part of the process is getting all the EPA approvals. I've got 8 EPA approvals, and they took time because each time I did something new, I had to go back to EPA and say, this is what I did. And they gave me an approval for it. It takes 3, 4, maybe sometimes 5 months to get an approval. But it's EPA approved, so all the states accept it. And it's done right. It can be done right on site. You don't have to ship asbestos up to a landfill. You can recycle some of the material. You can put some of it through a cement kiln or an asphalt kiln. And some of it can be used as road bed material, especially the cement board.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're I can't say enough for how pleased I am that you were available to join us today. I know there is a lot more to talk about. My line of work itself, we deal in counterfeit materials. That's part of what we're doing in the organization, both hazardous substance and counterfeit. And I know that there's a lot more to talk about relative to what's going on in other countries. So I'm going to invite you back. And I need to do a little bit of housekeeping here, but if you've got another comment or two, we've got about half a minute. And again, I thank you.
I thank you. And if we can discuss other countries, we can talk about Australia, Nigeria, Africa, India. There's a lot of asbestos out there.
Okay.
Australia has, Telstra from Australia has tremendous problems with asbestos. That's their phone company.
Well, I will start talking with you about the next time we get you on the show. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Stan. I really appreciate what you did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.